Hello, and welcome to another in our series of videos on the Scottish Wars of Independence. This video focuses on the Bruce's, and yes, that apostrophe is in the right place, the Bruce's Irish campaigns from 1315 to 1318. Our aim in this video is to learn about the Bruce's Irish campaign. By the end of it, hopefully, we'll be able to describe the events of Edward Bruce's Irish campaign, be able to explain the significance of the Irish campaign to the wider war, and be able to describe the events following the Irish campaign in the war zone of southern Scotland and northern England. As always, for students of higher history watching the video, taking notes of the information given in bold as we go through will help to support your studies. So to begin, the Irish campaign. Now to recap how we get to this stage in 1315. In 1314, Bruce had come to the high point so far in his campaigns against the English rule of Scotland. His army had defeated a much numerically superior force at the Battle of Bannockburn, sending Edward II packing back into England. As a result of this, Bruce was able to repatriate several important Scottish captives and secure the return from English captivity. This also included his wife, which allowed Bruce to get back to business with furthering the family line. In addition to this, the chance to ransom back many wealthy English nobles captured in the defeat meant that Bruce was able to swell his coffers with ransom money, which enabled him to continue to pay for the wars to press his bid to be recognised as the official King of Scotland. In the aftermath of the battle, Bruce held a parliament at Cambus Kenneth, just outside Stirling, in which he issued an edict that all Scottish nobles must come across to him and swear allegiance or risk forfeiting their family lands and their titles. This had the effect of bringing off a lot of the Scottish nobles who'd been sitting on the fence so far, waiting to see which way things panned out, and securing wider support for Bruce across Scotland. This was the platform upon which Bruce was to continue waging his war against the English. Significant for the Scots, so the Battle of Bannockburn was, if we recall, to the English, with a vibrant economy and extensive armies and nobility, the Battle of Bannockburn was by no means the end of the war. They still had plenty of resources in hand to continue the fight. Whilst the events at Bannockburn had been bubbling away, in the background, John Balliol, the erstwhile King of Scotland, had quietly slipped away and died on his family estates in France. This meant that Bruce had to deal with Balliol's successors, young pretenders to his throne. And that leads us neatly into the Irish campaign. In 1315, King Robert opened a second front by sending his younger brother, Edward Bruce, with an army to invade Ireland. And this was Bruce's most ambitious plan yet, and you can see he's building on the confidence that he has built up from Bannockburn. Since 1198, English had held significant power across the greater portion of Ireland. In fact, in 1198, King Henry II of England had invaded Ireland, and he'd given the part of it he controlled to his son John as a lordship when John was just 10 in 1177. When John succeeded to the English throne in 1199, he remained the Lord of Ireland and thereby brought the Kingdom of England and the Lordship of Ireland into personal union. By the time we got to the mid-13th century, while the island was nominally ruled by the King of England, from about 1260 the effective area of the country under his control began to recede. As various Cambro-Norman noble families died out in the male line, the Gaelic nobility actually began to reclaim their lost territory in the island of Ireland. Successive English kings did little to stem the tide. Instead, they used Ireland to draw upon men and supplies in the wars against Scotland and France. Now this is why the Bruces looked to extend the campaign, to open a second front in the island of Ireland itself. They want to hamstring the failing English control. On top of that, we also hear that the Balliol pretenders to Bruce's throne After the defeat at Bannockburn, the surviving members of the Balliol family had run and fled to their supporters in Ireland. So the younger Bruce is going not only to undermine English control, not only to open a second front, but also to snuff out the final dynastic opposition to the Bruce family's reign over Scotland. So the Bruces wanted to put further pressure on King Edward II, we can see therefore, and prevent him from using his Irish recruits against them in future wars. And obviously, dividing English forces and opening a second front can only help serve the Bruces' purpose in bringing the ultimate pressure to bear against the English and forcing the King of England to come to terms and recognise the Bruces as official kings of Scotland and end the War of Independence. Now, for the ambitious Edward Bruce, Robert Bruce's sole surviving brother, this new campaign offered him the chance of a throne of his own. At first, the campaign showed signs of success. Edward Bruce's meetings with the Gaelic Irish lords saw him crowned as the High King of Ireland in May 1316. Now, the Bruces had been invited across by the King of Tyrone. At this time, the remaining independent areas free of Anglo-Norman control in Ireland were small, independent kingdoms in themselves, small though they were by our concept of what a medieval kingdom may be. So Tyrone itself, a region in modern Ireland, had its own king. And this king, along with his vassals, some 16 minor nobles, came to the Bruces and invited them across to Ireland and promised their support. The King of Tyrone and his vassals would recognise Edward the Bruce formally as the High King of Ireland if he came across and lent them his support and his armies in an effort to eject the Anglo-Normans from the island of Ireland. This served Edward Bruce's ego very well. It gave him the chance to step out from his older brother's shadow, and it was agreed that if successful, he would stand as the King of Ireland, while his older brother would stand as the King of Scotland. Now, Edward the Bruce initially met with success when he came to Ireland. He defeated several English forces that mustered against him. He captured key English-held strongholds at the port of Dundalk and at the fortress of Carrickfergus, whilst managing to avoid larger English armies that were gathered together to try and hunt him down. Now, early victories, however, did not establish long-term authority for Edward Bruce. The nature of Irish politics themselves conspired to act against them. Ireland was never unified for more than a few years at a time under a high king. It was always made up of minor individual kingdoms with families and dynasties wanting to go off and do their own things. And Bruce got sucked into this dynamic of Irish society. Local feuds between Irish chieftains led to Edward Bruce having to fight men who'd only recently pledged to be his allies. This diluted his power and distracted him from his main purpose of driving the English out. The Scottish army marched across Ireland, devastating the local population, but they lacked the equipment, the supplies, and the numbers to capture Dublin, the main English stronghold, or many other English-held castles on the island. Now, Bruce had come with an army of 5,000 to Ireland. He had brought with him a force equivalent of what his older brother had led to victory against the English at the Battle of Bannockburn. He'd also brought an army that was full of Bannockburn veterans, men who'd served with the Bruces for 7 years and known year upon year of success against English occupation. These men knew what they were doing. They were disciplined veterans. This is the flower of the Scottish fighting force. So if the Scots ever had a chance to strike a blow against English occupation, be it in Scotland or Ireland, this was their chance. And Edward Bruce, as the campaign wore on, could start to see that slipping away. At one point, even his older brother appeared as well, leading a fresh Scottish army. And together, they still failed to secure the ultimate victory for Edward Bruce by taking Dublin. Now, on top of dealing with infighting amongst his allies, Edward Bruce had to deal with a significant environmental factor that really hampered his efforts. A mini ice age blew across northern Europe from 1315 onwards, resulting in several successive years of poor crops. Now, with such a reduced harvest, Edward Bruce could not supply his army for long in the field. Dublin was just too far from his base in Ulster in the north of Ireland to successfully keep his army in the field long enough to prosecute a siege and assault the town of Dublin. Robert Bruce returned to Scotland after only one season of campaigning. He didn't have the supplies to keep the men in the field to make their actions, to make their campaign stick against the English. And this was going to be a major problem in Edward Bruce's efforts. And after 3 years of fighting, continually foiled by a lack of supplies, a lack of resources, lack of men and siege equipment to achieve his ultimate goal of getting down to Dublin and staying there long enough to take the town, Edward Bruce's only achievements were retaining control over his family lands in Ulster and recapturing the strategic stronghold of the Isle of Man out in the Irish Sea. Disaster finally struck for him in October 1318. Eager to gain some prestige before Robert returned with yet another army to assist him, Edward Bruce launched a rash attack into Meath. The Scots were ambushed at the Battle of Falkirk, and the Scottish army were wiped out. Edward Bruce was slain by a common soldier from Drogheda. Now, politically, this was huge for the Scottish war effort. Robert the Bruce carried on the war over in Scotland with these repeated campaigns into northern England. Still had not managed to produce a male heir. His only heir was his daughter Marjorie, to his first wife. Edward the Bruce, before he left his campaign into Ireland in 1315, had been recognised as his older brother Robert's heir. Edward's death in battle meant Robert and the Bruce family had lost their only male heir to the throne. Whilst the Irish campaign was singularly disastrous for Edward Bruce, it was not so catastrophic to the Scottish cause. It did cost the Bruces a number of experienced soldiers who'd fought in their army at Bannockburn, and the loss of such experience on the battlefield would have been a blow to the Scottish cause, but it was not the be-all and end-all. The Irish campaign caused serious concerns for the English, which must be balanced against this. In England, military leaders were worried about the Bruces' ability to take the war to the English holdings in Ireland. The Bruces' success led to fear that a combined Celtic fringe alliance may have emerged, with the Scots, the Irish and the Welsh uniting together against England. The King of England faced the terrible strategic situation that he may be not quite surrounded, but not far off it. At that time, England was warring against France to the south across the Channel, was warring against Scotland to the north on its northern frontier, and to open up another war zone again in the west, its holdings in Ireland, and potentially provoking an uprising by the Welsh. England faced being overwhelmed by fighting a war on 3 different fronts, which would have been ruinously expensive, even for a kingdom as powerful and vigorous as the English in the start of the 14th century. This was quite the spectre for the English king to fear. In fact, it was the plan of Edward Bruce, had he been successful in Ireland and to have removed the control of the English, that he would have raised an army of Scots and Irish and gone and landed in Wales to provoke an uprising by the Welsh and then to have invaded into Western England. That would have been a nightmarish situation for the English to have had to deal with. Before his death, Edward Bruce had sent letters to the Welsh chieftains promising help in driving the English out of Wales, and this had led to thousands of Welsh soldiers being sent home from English armies for fear that they would rebel and join the Scots while they were still on campaign. So this move by the Bruces, even though it ultimately resulted in a failure, clearly spooked the English generals. The overall effect of the Irish campaign was to force England to divert significant time and resources from the war against the Scots in northern England. So Edward Bruce's efforts, even though they did ultimately result in failure, really had a very negative effect on Edward II's response to Robert Bruce's campaigns in the north of England. So 1319, Edward's new invasion. With Edward Bruce gone, the campaign in Ireland drawing to a close, Edward II was freed up to divert his attention again solely to Robert Bruce and what was going on with the north end of the Kingdom of England. Edward Bruce's death lifted English morale. By 1319, Edward II was back in York and he was planning a major new invasion into Scotland. By late August of 1319, he'd mustered 1,500 cavalry and 8,000 infantry at Newcastle. It was small in his Bannockburn army, about half the size, but it still doubled any force that the Bruce could gather. Edward's army marched north and they laid siege to Berwick, probably hoping to lure the Bruce into a battle and to get revenge for Bannockburn. Now, Berwick sat just on the border between Scotland and England. In fact, when Edward I had invaded Scotland way back now in 1296 and had so brutally butchered the population of the town, he had resettled it with English merchants and English townspeople. So in all the years since, when Bruce rose up, even when Wallace came back down in 1297 in the aftermath of the Battle of Southern Bridge, the Scots had a go at trying to get Berwick and trying to recapture it, because Berwick was one of the wealthiest cities in Scotland before the hostilities had broken out. And the Bruce had continually worked to try and retake the town. He'd only managed to get it in 1318. So when Edward is coming back up in 1319, he very much probably regarded it as an English possession. It had been in his hands, on the hands of his kingdom, for 22 years before Bruce had managed to sneak it back in 1318. Bruce, however, had seen Edward II coming. He'd already sent a sizable Scottish army south, avoiding Edward's own invasion, under his lords Randolph and Douglas, to raid into Yorkshire. Now, the Scots did as much damage to Yorkshire as possible, and this represents them getting further south again from the kind of war zone of the 1315 through to 1318 campaigns, where they focused on Northumberland and on Cumbria. So Yorkshire is really starting to push down into the heartland of England. Now, in response to these attacks, Edward was forced to abandon his siege of Berwick to try and head south and catch the invaders, protect his own heartlands. He failed to do so. Randolph and Douglas managed to slip home, not because of the threat of Edward, but because they simply could not carry any more loot. Once again, the Bruce had humiliated Edward. Now, by this point, we are pushing on into the 1320s now. Edward II has been on the throne of England for, well, by this point, 12 years. He's been around for some time, and he has experienced reverse after reverse, humiliation after humiliation at the hands of the Scots. And this is going to be becoming a kind of like an ongoing, repeated theme of his reign. Now, he's not going to give up. In fact, Edward II hurls himself at the Scots again and again and again. And then amongst these different attempts, he is dealing with issues back home with unruly barons who doubt his rule. Increasingly, he's going to find himself with problems closer to home as well, as his own queen is going to turn against him in the years to come. But Bruce, it can be seen, consistently gets the upper hand over Edward II and is turning the north of England into a war zone. So the focus of the war is moving away from Scottish territory and very firmly moving into English territory. And this is all about Bruce not trying to invade England, not trying to conquer England, and certainly not trying to really extend Scotland's borders. This is about pressuring the King of England into giving up on the war and into recognising the Bruce family as the legal occupants of the Scottish throne. That's what Bruce's aim is here. He's trying to win a diplomatic victory. Okay, today's big question. So having watched today's video, have a crack at these two questions. What do you think about these? Were the Bruces right to risk the Irish campaign from 1315? Was it worth the risk, the expenditure of resources, the men that they committed to the campaign, and ultimately the loss of the next in line to the throne, one of the few remaining Bruce brothers? Was it worth it? Did they get anything out of it? What do you think? And then in your opinion, to what extent therefore can Edward Bruce's campaign be regarded as a failure? Did it achieve anything? Was it worth that effort? What do you think? We'll discuss that in our next and final video in our series on the Scottish Wars of Independence. Until then, thanks for watching.